The bride had a hunchback she hid under a cloak. A blacksmith said, "Let me build you a better chair." The first thing I ever made that was worth a damn was a hook. Not a door hook, not a coat hook, a hook for a horse collar, 1-inch iron, double-shouldered, with a lip that wouldn't let go under load. I was 11 years old and my father stood over me at the anvil in the August heat and said nothing for a long time after I pulled it out of the slack tub and set it on the block. He turned it over twice, set it down, walked back into the house, didn't say a word. I took that as high praise. That was in 1847, outside of Carbondale, Illinois, where my father ran a forge that mostly shod horses and fixed broken plowshares, and occasionally made something a man actually needed: a wagon tongue brace, a barrel hoop, a set of gate hinges that wouldn't rust through their first winter. He was a competent man, my father, not inspired. Competent. He taught me how to read iron, how to feel the color of heat before you look at it, how to let the hammer do the work and not your back. That last one took me years to actually learn. I moved west in '61. Not because of the war. I was 25 and had 2 fingers on my left hand that were a different color than the rest from a burn I'd taken the year before, and no recruiter wanted a blacksmith who couldn't make a proper fist. I didn't argue. I moved west because a man I'd met at a hardware auction in Springfield told me about a town in Kansas Territory that had exactly no blacksmith and a population growing faster than a spring creek. He said the name, Harlan's Crossing. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 6 hours, loaded my tools into a borrowed wagon, and left. Harlan's Crossing in 1861 was 3 saloons, a dry goods store with a warped floor, a livery that smelled worse than any livery had a right to smell, 40-some houses in various states of incompletion, a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, and about 230 people who needed things fixed. I set up the forge on the north end of the main street, which they called Birch Street even though there wasn't a birch tree within 40 miles. I built the structure myself, post and beam, stone floor, a proper chimney, good deep coal storage. Took me 3 weeks. I slept in it the whole time, which was fine in August and less fine come September when the nights started biting. The town noticed me the way a town notices a blacksmith, immediately, practically, and without particular warmth. They came to me with work. I did the work. They paid me, sometimes in cash and sometimes in goods and sometimes in something close to honest appreciation. A farmer named Potts brought me a dozen eggs after I straightened the axle on his hay wagon that 2 other men had told him was finished. He set them on my workbench, nodded once, and left without a word. I made eggs every morning for 2 weeks and thought that was friendship enough for the time being. I was not a man who needed a great deal of company. I want to be clear about that because it matters for everything that comes after. I'm not saying I was cold or unfriendly or that I didn't know how to talk to people. I'm saying that the kind of loneliness a man feels when he doesn't have enough people around him, that particular ache, I didn't feel it much. I had my work. I had the fire. I had the satisfaction of a thing made right. What I did not have, for the first 3 years in Harlan's Crossing, was a single person who actually looked at me when they talked to me. They looked at their broken wheel, their bent hinge, their dull plow blade. They looked past me at what they needed fixed. That's not a complaint, that's just how it was. A blacksmith in a frontier town is a function, a necessity. Like water from a well, you don't look at the well, you look at the bucket. I was 30 before I understood that I'd gone hungry for something, without knowing the name of what I was hungry for. The Alderman family came to Harlan's Crossing in the spring of 1864. Father Cornelius Alderman, who everyone called Colonel even though he'd never held rank. A big red-faced man who laughed too loud and sold land he sometimes actually owned. Mother Bettina Alderman, a narrow woman from Ohio with good posture and the particular expression of someone who has spent her whole life slightly disappointed. And 2 daughters, Marguerite, the elder, who was 22, dark-haired, quick-eyed, and the kind of pretty that a town notices and talks about for a month, and Clara. Clara was 20. I didn't meet her for 6 weeks after they arrived. I met her father first. He came to me wanting decorative iron work for the gate of the house he was building on the east side of town. Scroll work, he said. Something that says quality. I told him I could do scroll work, but it would cost him and it would take 2 weeks. He said fine. He had a way of saying fine that made you feel he was doing you a favor. I met Marguerite at the church social the following Sunday, where I had gone because Mrs. Potts had told me with some force that I needed to attend at least occasionally, or the town would forget I was a Christian. I wasn't sure being forgotten as a Christian was the worst fate a man could face, but I went. Marguerite Alderman shook my hand and said she'd heard I was the blacksmith, and I said I was. She said that must be terribly hard work. I said it kept me occupied. She smiled and turned to talk to someone else. Clara wasn't at the church social. I didn't know that then. I only knew it later. What I knew about Clara Alderman before I met her came from the kind of talk that moves through a small town the way water moves under ice, quiet, cold, and getting into everything. She had a condition of the spine. That was how people said it. A condition of the spine, which meant that her upper back curved, not wildly, not grotesquely, but enough that you could see it when she wore certain things, enough that it changed the way she carried herself, the angle of her head, the particular set of her shoulders. She was not deformed in any way that made her less than a whole person. She was shaped differently than most. In a different world, that would mean nothing at all. In Harlan's Crossing, Kansas, in 1864, it meant people talked about her in the tone they used for unfortunate weather. She wore a cloak most days, heavy wool even when the weather didn't call for it, dark blue, almost black. She wore it the way a person wears armor, not for warmth. I know that now. At the time, I just knew she was the alderman girl who wore the cloak, the one who didn't come to socials, who went to the dry goods store in the early morning before most people were about, who sat in the back pew at church on the days she attended, and who had, according to Mrs. Potts, a suitor. His name was Harlan Webb. Yes, Harlan. A nephew of the original Harlan the town was named for, which he mentioned with some frequency. He was 30 years old, had a farm 3 miles east, and was reportedly the reason the Alderman family had come to Harlan's Crossing. Cornelius Alderman and the elder Harlan Webb had done business together in Ohio, and Cornelius had brought his daughters west with a particular hope about Harlan the younger. Marguerite, it was said, was not interested in Harlan Webb. Clara, it was said, was the fallback. That last part, that a man had looked at 2 women and chosen one for her looks, and when that one declined, turned to the other like she was a second plot of land to be surveyed. That piece of information sat in me for a while like a coal that won't go out. I didn't know why at the time. I just knew that every time someone mentioned Harlan Webb and Clara Alderman in the same sentence, something in my chest went tight and narrow. I was a blacksmith. I read heat. I should have known what that meant. I met her in June. The gate I'd made for Cornelius Alderman was done and installed, and he'd come to the forge to inspect it and pay the final amount. He brought Clara with him. I don't know why. Maybe she'd been in the wagon. Maybe he needed her company on the ride. She stood back while he looked at the gate work and made the sounds men make when they're going to approve of something but want you to wait for it. The scroll work was good. I knew it was good. I'd spent more time on it than the price warranted because the iron had told me to. Some pieces want to be made right, and you listen. Cornelius finally nodded and said it would do. He paid me. He started toward the wagon and then stopped and said over his shoulder that his daughter wanted to ask me something. He kept walking. I looked at Clara. She was standing about 10 feet from me beside my workbench, with the cloak on despite the June heat. She had brown hair, not as dark as her sister's, and a face that was careful. That's the word I keep coming back to. Careful. Like she'd learned to keep it a certain way and had gotten very good at it. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage after rain. She looked at me directly. That surprised me. A lot of people in that town had trouble looking at me directly, not because of anything wrong with me, but because I was large and my hands were scarred and I smelled like coal smoke and iron most of the time, and people found that combination a little hard to settle on. She looked straight at me and said, "Mr. Rourke, I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't say anything to my father about it." I said all right. She said she had a chair at home, a rocking chair that her mother had brought from Ohio. She said the chair was fine for most people, but it was wrong for her, wrong in the way it sat her, wrong in the angle. It put pressure in a bad place and made the long evenings painful. She'd tried cushions. She'd tried sitting differently. She said she'd read, in a letter from a doctor in St. Louis she'd corresponded with, that a chair could be built with the seat and back at a different angle than standard, with the rocker set differently. That would help. She had drawn it out. She produced a piece of paper from her coat pocket, folded 4 times, the edges worn like she'd been carrying it for a while. She held it out. I took it. I unfolded it carefully, which was harder than it sounds with hands the size of mine. It was a real drawing, not a sketch, an actual drawing dimensioned with notes in a precise small hand. She'd drawn the chair from 3 angles. She'd noted the angle of the seat relative to the floor, the angle of the backrest, the placement of the lumbar support, the rocker arc. She'd noted where the pressure points were in the standard chair and where she needed them to be instead. I looked at that drawing for a long time. I said, "Where did you learn to do this?" She said her father had taught her drafting when she was young, before he'd decided it wasn't a useful thing for a girl to know. She said it in a flat, even voice that contained a great deal that she didn't say. I said I could build this. She said how much. I said, "Let me think about that." What I was thinking about was not the price. I was thinking about the joinery on the rocker, about whether white oak or ash would hold the arc better, about the back angle, and how to make the lumbar curve without the chair looking made for a medical condition rather than just made. I was thinking about how you build something that serves a specific body without making that body feel served. There's a difference. I know that difference the way I know iron in my hands in the heat of the thing. I said, "I'll have it done in 3 weeks. Bring me the chair you have now so I can measure how wrong it is." She nodded once. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Rourke." She took the drawing back. I hadn't offered it. I'd just been holding it, turning it over, and she refolded it and put it back in her pocket. Then she walked to the wagon. Her cloak moved as she walked, and I could see the shape of her back under it, the curve at her shoulder blades, the way she carried her head slightly forward to compensate for the weight. It was not ugly. It was just a fact of her, the way the burn on my hand was a fact of me. I don't know what I expected to feel when I saw it. I felt nothing except that I wanted to build the chair right. She sent the old chair with a boy named Colton Hicks, who ran errands for the alderman household. Colton was 12 and interested in everything at the forge except the actual work, which he found too hot. He brought the rocker, collected 2 pennies I gave him, and went away. I spent an evening with the old chair before I even touched wood for the new one. I sat in it myself first. I know how that looks, a large, rough man folding himself into a woman's parlor rocker. I sat in it, and I felt where the angles were wrong. Not for me, for a body shaped the way her drawing had described. I put my hand behind my back and felt where the pressure would land, and it landed wrong. Wrong the way a poorly made joint is wrong, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but wrong in a way that would be, every single evening for as many evenings as a person lived with it, quietly unbearable. I don't get angry at furniture, but I felt something close to it. I found ash, good straight-grained ash from a pile a lumber man named Fitch had brought through in the fall and traded for wheelwork. Ash is honest wood. It doesn't pretend. It wants to flex and it wants to hold, and if you work with it right, it'll do both. I roughed out the pieces over 2 days, working in the evenings after the regular forge work was done. I didn't want the chair to come together in a shop that smelled like horses and smoke if I could help it, so I worked on it in the back, where the air moved better. I got the rocker arc wrong the first time. The numbers from her drawing were right, but I cut the curve slightly too shallow, and when I dry-fitted it, the chair sat back at the wrong angle. I cut new rockers and got it right the second time. I am not a man who finds mistakes embarrassing. Mistakes are how you learn what the material wants. But I found that particular mistake irritating in a way that surprised me. The lumbar curve was the interesting problem. Standard chairs have a straight back or a modest curve. What her drawing described was a specific arc that would cradle the upper spine in a particular way. She'd noted it precisely, even the radius of the curve in inches. I had to steam the back slats to get the bend and hold it with forms while they dried. I'd done steam bending before for wagon bows. This was finer work. I made a form from scrap pine, cut to the radius she'd drawn, and held the slats against it for a full day. When it came together, I set it in the middle of the back room and looked at it for a while. It was a good chair, not just serviceable, good. The proportions worked. The ash had a pale gold color that caught the lamplight clean. The seat was wide enough to settle into, the back angled at what her drawing specified, and the rocker touched the floor at a point that would, when a person of her height sat in it, let her feet rest flat while the chair moved. I couldn't be certain of all of it until she sat in it, but I believed I'd gotten it right. I oiled it with linseed and let it cure. She came 3 weeks and 2 days after our first meeting. Again in the morning, again with Colton Hicks driving the wagon. She came alone into the forge. Colton waited outside, and I brought her to the back room where I'd set the chair. She stopped in the doorway and looked at it. I said nothing. A made thing speaks for itself or it doesn't speak. She walked to it. She ran her hand along the back rail first, just one finger following the lumbar curve. She looked at the rocker arc. She looked at the joinery. Then she took off the cloak. I want to say that carefully. She took off the cloak, Not like a woman undressing, not dramatically, just folded it once and laid it over the workbench. And I saw her back. The wool dress she wore had a modest neckline in back, and I could see the line of her spine, the way the upper back curved, the breadth of her shoulders, which were broader than you'd expect. She was not fragile, she was built solid. The curve of her spine was simply what it was. She sat down in the chair. She didn't say anything for a moment. She adjusted her weight, shifted slightly to the left, then back center, and then she went still. Her hands came to rest on the armrests. Her feet touched the floor. She rocked once slowly. I watched her face. She was 40 years old before I was. What I mean is, I saw something cross her face that I'd only seen on older people, people who'd been carrying something hard for a long time and had learned to expect it wouldn't get lighter. It was the look of something set down. Just for a moment, right when the chair moved right and the pressure landed where it was supposed to land, and the relief came through her body like warm water, just in that moment she looked younger, lighter. She sat in the chair for a long time without speaking. I sat down on an upturned crate across the room and waited. I have learned, making things for people, that there's a moment after the thing is received that belongs to the person and not to you, and you let it pass in silence. She said, the back angle is exactly right. I said, good. She said, how did you know to make the seat this wide? I said I'd looked at her when she walked, the way she stood, her balance. I said I hoped that wasn't an imposition. She said it wasn't. She rocked again. She said, Mr. Rourke, what do I owe you? I said I'd thought about that, and I thought the old chair was payment enough if she wanted to leave it. I'd find a use for the wood. She looked at me then, turned her head and looked at me directly, the way she'd done the first time, and I held the look without flinching because I was not going to flinch. I'd meant what I said. The old chair was a bad chair, and I didn't want her paying cash to be rid of it. She said, that's not fair to you. I said maybe not, but it was what I wanted. She looked at me for another moment. She had the careful face, but right then, right in that back room with the chair moving under her and the ash smelling faintly of linseed, the careful face had come open a little, like a window someone had unlatched. She said, all right, Mr. Rourke, thank you. She put the cloak back on. Colton came to carry the chair to the wagon. She paid me anyway, tucked folded bills into my hand when I helped lift the chair and said it was for the wood cost at least, and I didn't argue. She walked to the wagon without looking back. I stood in the doorway of my forge and watched the wagon until it turned the corner onto Birch Street. Something had changed. I didn't know what to do about it, and so I went back to work. The next thing that happened was Harlan Webb. I knew who he was in the way you know anyone in a small town. By sight, by reputation, by the accumulated texture of what people said and didn't say. He was a large man who'd inherited good land and worked it with the steady industry of someone who was competent but not inspired. He drank moderately, went to church, was polite to women and rough with hired hands in the particular way that said he knew which behavior was being watched. He rode a good horse. He wore his hat straight on his head. He came to the forge in July for nothing in particular, a loose shoe on the good horse, which any farrier could have fixed. I fixed it. He stood and watched me work and made the kind of conversation that passes the time without meaning anything, and then toward the end, while I was clinching the nails, he said, not looking at me, "You built a chair for Clara Alderman." I said I had. He said, "What do you charge her for it?" I said that was between me and Miss Alderman. He looked at me then. He had blue eyes and a face that was used to things going the way he expected them to. He said, "You know she's intended for me." I said I hadn't heard that it was settled. He said, "It's settled enough." I set down the hoof, stood up, and looked at him. I am a large man, larger than Harlan Webb, and I know the effect of that when I decide to use it, which I do sparingly because it's not something I'm proud of. I looked at him and I said, "I built a chair because she asked me to build a chair. That's my business. Her personal arrangements are none of mine." He held the look for a moment. Then he nodded, the nod of a man recalibrating, not conceding. And he said what he owed me for the shoe, and he paid it, and he rode away. I watched him go the way I'd watched Clara's wagon. Then I went back to work. But I thought about what he'd said. Intended for me. That word, intended. Like she was a piece of property being allocated. Like being intended for a man was a fact about you, the same as the color of your hair. I thought about her face when she sat in the chair. the moment it unlocked. I thought, nobody who knows how to draw like that, nobody who carried that paper in her pocket long enough for the edges to wear, nobody who looked at me that directly and said what she meant without apology. Nobody like that should be intended for a man who thought of her as the fallback to her sister. I thought all of this, and then I put it away because it wasn't mine to hold. Or I tried to, the way you try to let a coal go out and it won't. The summer moved. Forge work was heavy drought that year, and farmers bringing in equipment that had been held together with the particular kind of hope that comes when you can't afford repair and you pray instead. I was busy every day, long into the evenings. Potts needed a new share for his plow. The livery wanted a complete reissue on 12 horses that had all gone too long between farriering. A man building a new house on the south end needed all his hardware, hinges, bolts, hooks, latch plates, and he needed them in 3 weeks because his family was coming from Missouri. I worked, that's what I know how to do. Clara came back in August. She came without Colton this time. She tied her horse to the post outside and came into the forge in the late morning when I was finishing up a set of hinges for the South End house. She stood at the edge of the work floor with her cloak on and waited until I'd finished the heat and set the work down. I pulled off my apron and said good morning. She said the chair had helped, significantly. She said the evenings were different now. She said she'd been sleeping better. I said I was glad to hear it. She said she wanted to ask me something else, and again, she'd appreciate it kept private. I said all right. She took a breath. She said, I've been asked, my father has agreed, though he hasn't told me he expects me to agree, to a formal introduction to Harlan Webb. A dinner at our house with his family, next month. I waited. She said, I'm told a woman in my situation should be grateful for the interest. Her voice when she said it, not bitter exactly. The way a person sounds when they've heard something said enough times that the rage at it has gone flat, worn smooth from being turned over too many times. I said, what do you think of that? She looked at me with those gray-green eyes. She said, I think I'm a person, Mr. Rourke, with a mind and a will and the ability to make a chair drawing that was, you told me, correct. I think I'm not a problem to be solved by marrying me to a man who already looked at my sister first. She said it quietly, without heat, just the plain facts of it. I said, then don't. She said her father would be furious. I said, I imagine so. She said she had nowhere to go, no income, no independent means, she couldn't exactly homestead. I said, no, but you could do other things. This is a town that doesn't have a schoolteacher worth the name. The woman currently teaching the church school can barely read herself. Clara looked at me for a moment. She said, my father would say that's not suitable. I said, what do you say? She was quiet, a wagon went by outside, the fire in the forge ticked. She said, I say I'd rather be a schoolteacher than a man's second choice. I said, then that's where to start. She looked at me as if she was trying to figure out what I was, what I wanted. I held the look and let her look. She said, why do you care about this, Mr. Rourke? I thought about lying, about saying something comfortable and general about women's situations and men's nonsense. I thought about deflecting, about turning it into something practical. Then I thought about the paper she'd carried in her pocket until the edges wore. I thought about the way she'd looked when the chair moved right. I said, because you can draw a rocking chair better than most men I know can describe one. Because you said what you wanted without dressing it up. Because you came to a blacksmith instead of putting up with a bad chair for the rest of your life, and that tells me something about you. She was still watching me. I said, and because a man who'd look at your sister first doesn't deserve to look at you second. It was the most I'd said about a personal matter in 3 years in that town, maybe longer. She looked at the forge, she looked at my hands, she looked at me. She said, I'll think about the school. She left, but she left differently than she'd come in. There was something in how she walked, not the deliberate, careful carriage, not the weight of managing herself in a world that watched. Just a woman walking to her horse, thinking. I went back to the hinges. The dinner at the Alderman house happened in September. I know because Colton Hicks came by the day after, and with the guileless precision of a 12-year-old told me everything. That Mr. Webb had come with his mother and his brother, that there'd been a big roast and apple cake, that Miss Clara had sat very straight at the table and spoken very little, and that Mr. Webb had talked mostly about his land. I said, and how was Miss Marguerite? Colton said Marguerite hadn't been there, which was interesting. I said, how was Miss Clara at the end of the evening? He thought about it. He said, tired. I said, was she polite? He said yes, but the polite kind that meant she was angry. I gave him 3 pennies for the report and told him to stop eavesdropping on other people's dinners. He said he would and didn't mean it, which I knew. I thought about her sitting straight at that table, in the cloak or out of it, being looked at and evaluated by a man who had wanted her sister first. I thought about the careful face. I thought about how much energy it costs to hold yourself that way for an entire evening. Then I did what I do, which is make something. What I made was not for her specifically, or I told myself that. It was for the school, or I told myself that too. The church school had 2 long benches on either side of a central aisle, and all the children sat on them regardless of size or need. I'd been past the school a few times and seen the younger ones perched up there with their feet not touching the floor, shifting their weight every few minutes. I'd thought about it idly before. Now I thought about it with some intention. I went to see Reverend Hobbs on a Tuesday. He was a small, bearded man who smelled like pipe tobacco and had more practical sense than piety, which I appreciated. I told him I could build adjustable benches for the school, proper ones, with footrests at different heights, the seats angled so children could sit without slipping. I told him I'd do the ironwork and supply the hardware, if he could find someone to supply the lumber. He said, "What do you want for it?" I said I didn't want anything for it. He looked at me over his pipe. He said, "And do you want Miss Alderman to know you did this?" I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "Yes, you do." I said, "I'd appreciate it if you found her the job, Reverend." He said, "The school board is 3 ranchers' wives and they'll have opinions about a woman with a—" He stopped. He said, "About Miss Alderman's situation." I said, "The woman they have now can't do long division." He said, "Long division isn't what the ranchers' wives are concerned about." I said, "Tell me their names." He told me their names. They were Mrs. Potts, Mrs. Garfield, and Mrs. Crane. I knew all 3. I'd done work for all 3 households. I didn't have leverage, exactly. I had something different. I had the thing that comes from being known as a man who does what he says and doesn't ask for much. In a small town, that's a currency. I went to see Mrs. Potts first because I trusted her most. I told her what I thought of Clara Alderman without saying more than necessary. I said the woman could do the job properly, and the children in that school deserved a teacher who could actually teach them. I said a person's back didn't have anything to do with algebra. Mrs. Potts looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're sweet on her." I said I was making benches for the school. She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I think she deserves the job." She said, "I'll talk to the others." September became October. The nights came earlier and colder. I stoked the forge later each day, and the dark outside the open forge door became blue-black and full of the smell of dried grass and something sharp and mineral that the plains have in autumn, a scent like cold iron. I'd finished the benches, and they were installed. I'd done them in walnut. I had some walnut in the lumber store, too good for regular work, and the ironwork was better than it needed to be, which was my habit when something mattered. Adjustable footrests in 3 positions, bolt through and lock nut so they'd hold but could be changed. I cut a thread pattern on the adjusters that I'd never used before, finer than standard, because I wanted them to be easy even for small hands. Clara Alderman was hired to teach the church school in October. I heard this from Colton Hicks, who heard it from his mother. I heard also from Colton that Harlan Webb had spoken to Cornelius Alderman again about the matter of the formal arrangement, and that Cornelius Alderman was in a difficult mood about the school business. I heard 3 days later that Clara Alderman had told her father she was not going to agree to a formal arrangement with Harlan Webb, and that the discussion had been loud enough to be heard from the street. I went about my work. But I began, and this is the part of it that I find hardest to say plainly, even now, I began to do something I had never done before in my life, which is to think about another person most of the day. Not to think about their work or their problem or their needs, but to think about them. To think, did she eat this morning? To think, is the walk from the Alderman house to the church school long enough in this cold that she needs better boots? To think, is she sitting in her chair tonight? I am not a romantic man. I want to be clear about that. I have no poetry in me, and I have never been one of those men who mistakes wanting something for a right to have it. But there is a difference between romance and recognition, and what I felt was more like recognition. A man who has been looking at iron his whole life knows the difference between iron, that is what it pretends to be, and iron that is something else, and Clara Alderman was something else. She was the real thing. I didn't know how to say that to her, and so I didn't say it. I watched the weather, I worked. In November, she came to me with a problem. Not a furniture problem, a structural problem. The school building, the church, had a section of the north wall where the chinking had failed, and the cold was coming through in a way that made the room on the north side nearly useless in the morning before the stove got going. She talked to Reverend Hobbs. He'd talked to the deacons. The deacons said they'd see about it. 2 weeks had passed and nothing had been done. She came to the forge on a Wednesday afternoon and laid it out plainly. The children on the north benches, which were her benches, the ones I'd made, were sitting in coats, and she could see their breath. She said she'd tried stuffing rags into the chinking herself, and it hadn't held. I said, let me see it. We walked to the church together. She walked beside me, and she wasn't wearing the cloak. She had a wool coat instead, properly cut, which I noticed. We didn't talk on the walk. The cold was serious that day, a flat gray sky sitting low over the plains, and the wind had an edge. She walked briskly. I matched her pace without having to slow down much. Inside the church, she showed me the wall. The chinking had failed in a section about 4 feet wide between 2 upright logs, and the gap let in a draft I could feel on my face from 6 feet away. The previous chinking had been poorly mixed, I could see that. Too much sand, not enough clay binder, and it had dried and cracked and worked loose. I said I could fix it in a morning. She said the deacons said. I said the deacons aren't the ones sitting in it. She looked at me. Her breath made small white clouds in the cold church air. I went back to the forge, mixed a proper chinking compound from clay and sand and a little lime, and came back with it the next morning before the school day started. I remixed the old chinking out of the gap, cleaned the surfaces, packed in the new material, worked it in firmly with a flat tool I'd made years ago for exactly this kind of joint. It took 2 hours. Clara was there when I started, and she sat on the far bench and did preparation work for the day's lessons while I worked. The children came in at 8, and I was finishing up when they filed through the door, stopping to look at me the way children look at a strange, large man in their space, cautiously, openly, with interest. A boy of about 9 said, "Are you fixing the wall?" I said I was. He said, "Are you Miss Alderman's friend?" I said I was her blacksmith. Behind me, I heard Clara make a sound, not a laugh exactly, something that could have been a laugh if she'd let it be. I smoothed the last section and stood up. The wall was solid. I cleaned my tools and packed them. The room was already warmer, the draft was gone, and the stove was doing its work properly. I put my coat on at the door. Clara was at the front of the room setting out primers on her desk. I said I'd check it after it cured, make sure it was holding. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Rourke," and I went back out into the cold. I want to tell you about the day in December because that's the day everything shifted, and I want to tell it straight. It was a Sunday. I'd been at the forge since early, working on a commission, a rifle butt plate, and trigger guard and iron for a man who'd come through from Colorado, and I'd lost track of the time the way I do when the work is interesting. The forge was hot, and the light outside had gone gray-blue before I noticed it was late afternoon. I heard the knock at the forge door. I'd half closed it against the cold and called out that I was open. It was Clara. She was not wearing the cloak. She was wearing the wool coat, and she was holding something in both hands, a tin I could see, and there was steam coming from it. She said, "I made soup. I thought you might not have eaten." I hadn't eaten. I'd forgotten entirely. I set down the work and took off my leather apron, and she set the tin on the workbench that wasn't covered in iron work, and she'd brought 2 enamel cups, and she poured soup into both. We sat, she took the stool I kept for customers, and I sat on the upturned crate, and we drank soup in the forge. Beef and potato thick, with something in it I couldn't identify at first and then recognized as thyme. Good soup. The kind a person makes when they actually know what they're doing. I said, "You can cook." She said, "I can do a number of things my father considers irrelevant." I said, "What does he consider relevant?" She said, "Being married to Harlan Webb." I said, has he given up on that? She said, no. She said he'd told her last week that she was behaving willfully and that a woman with her situation, there it was again, that word, should not be willful. She looked into her soup when she said it. I said, what did you say to him? She said she'd said that she appreciated his concern, and she was going to keep teaching, and she did not intend to marry Harlan Webb. I said, and he said. She said, he said a good deal more, but the substance was that she was costing him a business arrangement, and she needed to stop thinking about what she wanted and start thinking about what was practical. The forge ticked. The fire was low, the coals settling. She said, still looking at her cup, Mr. Rourke, can I ask you something personal? I said yes. She said, why aren't you married? It surprised me. I turned the cup in my hands. I said I hadn't found anyone worth building for. She looked up. The careful face had come completely open. She wasn't managing anything in that moment. She said, that's a strange way to put it. I said, maybe, but that's how I think about it. I make things. If I can't think of anything I want to make for a person, something that fits them specifically, that they'd need and use, then there's not enough. There has to be something I want to make. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what would you make for someone you felt that way about? I thought about it honestly. I said, I don't know yet. I'd have to know her properly first. What she needed, what didn't fit. You can't build for a person you don't know. She held the look. She said, you made me a chair without knowing me. I said, you gave me the drawing. She said, most people would have just made a chair. I thought about that. I said, well, that would have been a waste of good ash. She laughed. Actually laughed, not the almost laugh from the church, but the real thing, unexpected, like something that had gotten loose. It changed her face entirely. The laugh didn't last long, but the result of it did. She sat there in my forge with her soup getting cold and a different expression on, something open and warm and tired and not careful, and I thought, there it is. That's the real one. That's the face under the careful face. I said because I figured it was time. I'd like to call on you, if you'll allow it. Properly, I'll speak to your father. She looked at me, not surprised exactly. More like she'd been waiting to hear it, and now that she'd heard it, she didn't know what to do with it. She said, my father won't approve. I said, no. But I'm not asking your father. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought I'd read it wrong, that I'd made a mistake, that the careful face would come back and she'd fold herself up and go. She said, it's not, she stopped. She said, you know what I look like, Mr. Rourke. I said, I know exactly what you look like. She said, then you know what you'd be, what people would say. I said, people say things about a blacksmith no matter what he does. I've been working here for 3 years and most of this town doesn't know my first name. I said, I'm not interested in what people say, I'm interested in you. She looked at me for a long time. She had the gray-green eyes, the sage-rain color, and in the forge light they were lit gold around the edges. She said, my first name is Clara. I said, I know. She said, and yours? I said, Eli. She said it, just said it, my name in her mouth. Eli. I had not heard my name said like that I couldn't remember, like it was a thing worth saying, like there was a person at the other end of it. She said, all right, Eli. She said it meant she'd allow it. I knew what she meant. She poured more soup into my cup. We sat in the forge until it was dark, and she went home, and I sat for a while after in the quiet and looked at the banked fire. I spoke to Cornelius Alderman the next week. I want to be honest about this because it wasn't pretty. I went to the house on a Tuesday evening and asked to see him, and was brought into a parlor that smelled like beeswax and propriety. He sat across a table from me, and I saw him looking at my hands, at the scars, at the size of me, and doing the arithmetic of what a blacksmith was worth against what he'd imagined for his daughter. I told him I wanted to call on Clara. I told him my situation, what the forge brought in, what I owned, what I'd built. I told him I intended to be honest with him about the nature of my interest and the seriousness of it. He listened, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, you understand that I have made other arrangements. I said, I understand that Miss Clara has declined those arrangements. He said, that is not her decision to make. I thought about what to say and how to say it. I thought about the drawing in her pocket with the worn edges. I thought about her sitting in a cold church and packing rags into a wall. I said, Mr. Alderman, Your daughter has a mind that most men in this town would trade theirs for. She's running that school better than it's ever been run. She did the technical drawings for her own chair adjustments more accurately than half my customers describe what they need, and she'd never picked up drafting in 10 years. A man who doesn't see that when he looks at her is looking at the wrong thing. He looked at me not warmly, but differently. He said, "And what do you see when you look at her, Mr. Rourke?" I said, "A woman worth building for." He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He said he would think about it. I said that was all I asked. I went home, I didn't sleep much. I worked the next morning on the rifle piece, and I made the trigger guard wrong, made it right-handed when it wanted to be left, and had to start again, which told me where my head was. She found out I'd gone to see her father before he told her, because Colton Hicks was, as established, a useful and indiscreet child. She came to the forge on Thursday morning before the school day. She came straight in and stood in front of me, and I stopped what I was doing. She said, "You went to see my father." I said I had. She said, "Without telling me you were going to." I said yes. She said, "I would have liked to know." I said I understood that. I said I'd done it the traditional way without thinking about whether the traditional way was the right way in her situation. I said I was sorry for not telling her. She looked at me, she said, "He'll say no." I said maybe. I said I'd still like to call on her, that if she was willing, her father's opinion was his own business. She said that would cause a great deal of trouble. I said, "I know." She said, "And you'd do it anyway." I said, "I'd do it anyway." She held the look, then she said, "My father is going to want to speak to you again." I said, "All right." She said, "He's going to say things about he's going to say things." I said, "Clara, I know what your back looks like, and I've known it since June, and it hasn't changed a single thing I think about you. Whatever he says, it won't." She looked down. Just for a moment, she looked down at her hands, which were clasped in front of her, and something moved across her face that I won't try to describe because I don't have the words for it. The closest I can come is this. She looked like a person who has been braced against a blow for so long that being told the blow isn't coming feels like its own kind of shock. She looked up, she said, "He's going to say you're only interested because no one better would have me." I said, "There is no one better." I said it flat, the way I say things I mean, not flowery, not for effect, just the plain fact of what I thought. She stood there for a moment, then she said, "You're a strange man, Eli Rourke." I said, "I've been told." She almost smiled. She said she had to get to the school. She said all right, she'd come by on Saturday if her father hadn't locked her in. She didn't say it as a joke. Saturday she came, and on the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Those weeks in December, I will not dress them up. We talked. That was most of it. She sat on the stool with her coat, and I worked or I set the work down, and we talked. She told me about Ohio, about the house she'd grown up in, about the year she'd been sick, and a doctor from Cincinnati had come and used words she'd looked up later in a medical dictionary her father kept in his study. She told me about what those words meant and what they didn't mean, what the curve was and what it wasn't, the parts of it that caused pain and the parts that were just the shape of her and not painful at all. She told it matter-of-factly, like a person reporting the weather, and I listened the same way. I told her about my father's forge in Illinois, about the first hook, about moving west, about the 3 years in Harlan's Crossing where no one had known my first name. She said, "That's lonely." I said, "I thought it wasn't. Then I met you and I understood it was." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I've been lonely since I was 14. She said it without pity, just the fact of it. I said, 14, that's young. She said, "That's when I understood what I looked like to other people. That's when I started carrying it differently." I said, "How do you carry it now?" She was quiet for longer this time. She said, "Differently than I used to. Since the chair." I thought about that. I thought about what it must have been to go into a stranger's forge with a piece of paper, to hand it to a man who had scarred hands and smelled like smoke, to say here, "This is what I need, this is what I've been unable to ask for." The specificity of that ask, the trust in it. I said, "I'm glad you came." She said, "I almost didn't. I almost sent Colton with the drawing." I said, "I'm glad you didn't." She looked at me. The fire was low. It was nearly dark outside, and the cold was pressing against the walls of the forge with a particular insistence. She was on the stool, and I was on the crate, and we were about 6 feet apart, which was the distance we'd kept all through December. She said, "What are you building now?" "When I'm not here." I told her, the rifle piece for the Colorado man, a gate latch for a widow on the south end, and something for myself. An anchor bracket for a shelf system. I'd been wanting to put up proper shelves in the back room for years, and had never done it. She said, "What would you put on the shelves?" I said, "Books mostly. I had about 30 books in a crate under the workbench, and they'd been in that crate for 3 years. She looked at me, she said, "You have 30 books." I said, "I read at night." She said, "What do you read?" I named some of them. She named a few back books she'd read, some of them the same. We went back and forth that way for a while, and I had the odd sensation, odd because I'd never felt it before, of being properly known. Of having someone look at the same books and recognize them, and through the books, recognize something about me. She said, "I didn't know that about you." I said, "You hadn't asked." She said, "I'm asking now." I said, "I know." The fire had gotten down to coals. I should have built it back up, it was cold, but I didn't want to move. She'd crossed her legs on the stool and was sitting sideways on it, one elbow on the workbench, looking at me with the fully open face. She said, "Eli." I said, "Yes." She said, "Come sit closer." I moved the crate. I sat close enough that our knees were almost touching. She looked at me. The forge fire light was amber on her face. She reached out and put her hand on my forearm. Through the work shirt, just her hand on my arm, fingers curled slightly, holding. She said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For the chair, for the wall, for speaking to my father, for the benches, for—" She stopped. She said, "For looking at me and not looking away." I turned my arm and took her hand in mine. My hand is large and scarred, and hers was smaller and smooth, and she didn't pull back from the scars. I said, "You make it easy." She said, "Nobody has ever said that." I said, "Then nobody's been paying attention." She held onto my hand. We sat there in the amber dark of the forge, and outside the plains were cold and vast, and the town was going about its business, and somewhere across town Harlan Webb was eating his dinner without knowing that his second choice had become my first and only, and it had been that way since I'd watched her walk to her horse in June. Her father spoke to me again in January. The second conversation was nothing like the first. He was colder, more deliberate, and he came to the forge so he was on my ground, which I thought took some honesty. He sat down. I'd put out the chair I kept for customers, which was not a comfortable chair, and he laid it out. He said Clara had told him she intended to continue seeing me. He said he had not given his approval. He said the arrangement he'd had with Harlan Webb was a good arrangement for the family, and he'd like me to consider whether I was acting in good faith by interfering with it. I sat across from him. I said, "Mr. Alderman, your daughter is 20 years old. She is teaching 30 children arithmetic and reading and doing it well. She is a person of intelligence and will. She has told you she does not wish to marry Harlan Webb, and I believe she means it. My question to you is, what is the arrangement good for exactly if the person in it doesn't want to be there?" He said, "You don't have children. You don't understand what a father's responsibilities are." I said, "I understand what it is to be looked at and not seen. I understand what a person does with themselves when they spend years being that. I know your daughter, and I think you may not." He was quiet. I said, "I'm not a wealthy man. I own this forge and the land it sits on, and I have no debts. I work hard, and I do work worth doing. I will not promise you I'm the best you could find for her. I will promise you I am the one she has chosen, and I think that matters." He looked at his hands. He said, "She has a condition." There it was. I said, "She has a spine that curves. She also has a mind that doesn't. I know which one I'm thinking about." He didn't say anything. I said, "I will take care of her, Mr. Alderman. Not because she can't take care of herself, she clearly can and does, but because that's what it means to be with someone. You take care of each other. I'd like the chance to do that." He looked at the forge. The fire was going strong. I'd built it up that morning, and the heat filled the room. He said finally, "She's stubborn." I said, "Yes." He said, "She'll argue with you." I said, "Good." He made a sound, not quite a laugh. Almost, he said, "You're a strange man, Rourke." I said, "I've been told." He stood up, he looked at me. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no, he said, "Don't make her unhappy." I said, "That's not something I'd know how to do." He went home. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks Clara came to the forge on Saturdays, and I came to the Alderman house twice for Sunday supper, where Cornelius Alderman sat at the head of the table and ate his food in silence. And Bettina Alderman asked me about the business of blacksmithing with the polite incomprehension of a woman who had never thought about iron in her life. And Clara sat across from me and watched me navigate her family with a careful expression that occasionally, when I said something right, broke into the real one. In February, the cold broke briefly, a week of warm days that fooled the crocuses, and on a Saturday she came to the forge and said, "Would I like to walk?" I said yes. We walked south out of town on the road that went toward the river, which was still iced in sections, but running free in the middle. And the sky was that particular February blue that is so clear it seems like something you should be careful about. She didn't wear the cloak, the wool coat buttoned and her hair pinned back, and a dark hat she held on against the wind when it came up. We walked side by side and talked and didn't talk, the way you can with someone you've been with long enough. The grass was still winter brown, but there were a few green blades coming up in the low spots. She stopped at a bend in the river where the ice had gone, and there was a pool, still and dark. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "What happens when you get tired of it?" I said, "Of what?" She turned to look at me. She said, "The looks, the talk, my father's moods, being the blacksmith who—" She stopped. She said, "People talk about you already, you know, about why you'd choose." I said, "Clara." She stopped. I said, "I have been in this town for 4 years. I have not had a single conversation worth remembering until you walked into my forge with a piece of paper. I am 51 years old, and I have exactly one life, and I am not going to spend what's left of it being the blacksmith who chose not to." She was looking at me. I said, "I don't get tired of things that are right. Ask Potts what I charged him for the 3rd time I reset his plowshare because he kept running it into rock. I fixed it right every time, and I never charged him extra, and I never once told him he was being careless, because the work was right, and that's what you do." She said, "I'm not a plowshare." I said, "No, you're considerably more interesting than a plowshare." She laughed, the real one again, the laugh that changes her face. She looked at the river. She said, "I'm scared." I said, "I know." She said, "Not of you. I want to be clear, not of you specifically. Of what it means to let myself." She stopped again. She said, "I have kept myself very controlled for a long time. It has kept me from being hurt in certain ways." I said, "And from other things?" She said, "Yes, and from other things." I said, "You can keep being controlled. I don't need you to stop. I'm not asking for something different. I like the controlled version. I like the version that walked into a forge with a drawing." She turned and looked at me fully. Her eyes had tears in them, not falling, just there, pooled and caught. She said, "Eli." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think I love you." She said it the way she said everything, clearly, plainly, without decorating it, like a fact she'd established and was reporting. I reached out and took her hand, right there on the bank of the frozen river with the February wind coming off the plains. I said, "I know, I've known since October." She said, "October." I said, "The soup, you brought soup." She made a sound, half laugh, half something else. She said, "That's when you knew." I said, "That's when I was sure." She looked down at our hands. I felt her squeeze. My hand is twice the size of hers, and she wrapped her fingers around the 2nd and 3rd finger of mine. That was all she could reach, and she held on. She said, "I love you." She said it again, plainer this time, not reporting, saying. I said, "I love you, Clara." We stood there on the river bank. The water ran dark and clear over the rocks in the middle of the pool. The sky was that February blue. She leaned against me, put her shoulder into my arm and leaned, and I felt the shape of her back against my side, the curve of it, the realness of it, and I didn't shift or adjust. I just stood there and let her lean and looked at the river. The spring brought more work. A cattle rancher north of town was building out his corrals and needed posts, pins, and a complete set of gate hardware, 18 gates across 5 pens. It was the biggest single commission I'd had in Harlan's Crossing, and it kept me busy for 6 weeks. Clara was finishing the school year. On some evenings, she would come by after the school day and do her lesson preparation at my workbench while I finished the last of the day's work. And we'd be in the same space in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have found each other and have the ease of that. Harlan Webb came by in March. He came in the morning on a weekday and stood in the doorway of the forge for a moment before I looked up. I set down the post pin I was working and waited. He said, "I hear you're keeping company with Clara Alderman." I said I was. He said, "You know her father had spoken to me about that arrangement." I said, "I know Clara spoke to her father about it too." He was quiet. He looked at the forge, at the iron on the block. He said, "She has a condition, Rourke." I picked up my hammer. I said, "Harlan, I'm going to say this once. Clara Alderman is the most capable person in this town, and she has chosen who she wants to be with, and that's not you. I'd encourage you to find someone who chooses you the first time, because that's worth more than an arrangement." He looked at me. I held it. He said, "Her father's still going to want that land deal." I said, "Talk to her father about the land deal. Leave Clara out of it." He held the look a moment longer. Then he nodded, the same recalibrating nod as last time, and he went. I turned back to the post pin. It had cooled and I had to reheat it. While I waited, I thought he'd never looked at her. He'd looked at the condition, the arrangement, the fallback. He'd never looked at the woman. His loss. We were married in June. Cornelius Alderman walked her down the aisle with the expression of a man who has come to terms with something and is choosing to be gracious about it, which is about the best you can ask from certain fathers. Bettina Alderman cried, which surprised me, until Clara told me later that her mother had been crying because she'd thought, after 14, that Clara would never get this day, and the crying was relief. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just told Clara her mother was welcome at the house whenever she wanted to come. The church was full. Harlan's Crossing turned out for a wedding the way it turned out for anything, practically, in numbers. Mrs. Potts sat in the third row and nodded at me when I caught her eye, the nod of a woman who had been right about something and was quietly enjoying it. Reverend Hobbs did the ceremony with a minimum of fuss. Colton Hicks sat in the back with two other boys his age, and all three of them were on their best behavior, which meant they were only slightly disruptive. Clara walked down the aisle without the cloak. In the white dress that Bettina Alderman had made for her, high-necked, long-sleeved, proper for the era, and her hair put up. And she walked with that particular deliberate carriage of hers, and she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. I want to be clear about that. I have made beautiful things. I know what beautiful is. I know the particular rightness of a thing that has been made the way it wanted to be made, the fit of it, the proportion. Clara walking down the aisle was that. The way a perfectly drawn curve is beautiful. The way a good rocker arc is beautiful. Not in spite of what it is, but because of exactly what it is. She stood across from me. Reverend Hobbs said the words. She said I do in a clear voice. I said I do in the voice I have, which is large and low and probably echoed. Then she put her hand in mine. The house we moved into was the Forge House. I'd been adding rooms to it since November, when I'd started to understand how things would go. I'd built a proper bedroom with good board and batten walls and a proper floor. None of the packed earth nonsense I'd been living with. And I'd built it with wide doorways and a low step down into the back garden because I'd thought about what made movement easy for her and built to that. Not a medical house, a good house, just made right. The rocking chair was in the bedroom. She'd brought it from the Alderman house in the wagon along with her books and her clothes and the medical dictionary she'd reclaimed from her father's study. When the wagon was unloaded, she took the chair into the bedroom herself. I offered to help, and she said no, she had it, and she carried it in with both arms. I watched her set it in the corner by the window. She turned it to get the angle of the light right. She sat in it. She looked at me. She said, "Did you know when you built it that it was going to end up here?" I said, "I hoped." She said, "You hoped." I said, "I built it the way I build things that matter, things that are going to be used for a long time." She rocked once. The floorboards were new and solid, and the chair was level on them. She said, "It still fits perfectly." I said, "I made it to fit you. It'll fit you your whole life." She looked at me and the careful face was completely gone. It had been gone, I'd noticed, for about 3 months, since February at least. Since the river. She'd stopped needing to carry it when she was with me, and now she didn't carry it at all, at least not in the house, at least not when it was just us. She said, "Come here." I walked to her. She reached up and took hold of my hand, the big, scarred one, the one with the different colored fingers, and she turned it over and put her lips against the palm. It was a small thing. It was the largest thing that had happened to me in my life. I stood there in the doorway of our bedroom with my hand in her hands while she sat in her chair, and I thought, I have been making things for 30 years, and this is what it was for. Not the hinges, not the shoes, not the gate work or the decorative scroll work or the rifle fittings. All of it was toward this. The knowing how to build for a specific body, the knowing how to listen to what a thing needs rather than what you think it should be, all of it was practice for this. She let go of my hand. She said, "You're crying." I said, "I'm not." She said, "Eli." I said, "Smiths don't cry." She said, "You're going to need a different rule." I sat down on the edge of the bed, across from her. The evening light came through the west window and lay across the floor in a long bar of gold and dust. She rocked. I sat. We didn't say anything for a while. I want to tell you one more thing before I'm done, because it's the part that stays with me most. About 6 months after we were married, in December of that year, a woman came to the forge. She was traveling through, not from Harlan's Crossing, heading further west with her husband and 2 children. Her name was Mrs. Lowe, and she was perhaps 30, and she had something wrong with her left leg, some old injury or birth condition that made walking painful. She'd heard from someone in the town that there was a blacksmith in Harlan's Crossing who built things fitted to people. She showed me what she'd been using. A crutch, standard, a single-piece thing with a rounded top that had been rubbing her armpit bloody. She'd wrapped cloth around it, then more cloth, and it was still wrong. I could see from how she held it that she'd been tilting her whole body to compensate, and her back was going to give her trouble from it within a year. I looked at the crutch. I thought about the angle. I said, "Let me make you a better one." She looked at me. She said, "How long will it take?" I said, "Come back in the morning." She came back in the morning. I'd made the crutch from ash, good straight ash, with a padded top support at a different angle, angled toward the natural position of her arm rather than straight vertical, with a grip handle placed where her hand actually wanted to be rather than where a standard crutch put it. The thing was fitted to her height to the inch. I'd worked most of the night. She took it from me. She fitted under her arm. She took 3 steps. She stopped. She said, "Oh." I said, "Is that better?" She turned around and walked back, and her whole carriage was different. The tilt was gone. The compensatory lean was gone. She was walking close to straight. She said, "Oh." She said it again. She couldn't. She put her hand over her mouth. I said, "Let me know if the grip angle wants adjusting." Her husband was standing in the door of the forge. He looked at me the way men look at you when you've done something for their person that they couldn't do, something complicated and grateful and a little undone. He said, "What do I owe you?" I named a fair price. He paid it. They went. I watched the wagon until it turned south toward the trail. Clara was standing behind me. She'd come to the forge that morning. She did, sometimes, just to see what I was working on, to drink coffee by the fire. She'd seen the whole thing. She put her arm around my waist. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That's what you do." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You look at what doesn't fit, and then you fix it." I thought about that. I said, "I do that for iron." "Mostly." She said, "Not mostly." I turned and looked at her. She was looking out at the road where the wagon had gone, with a small, settled expression. The expression of a woman who has arrived at something she believed, and was saying it out loud for the first time. She turned to me. She put her head against my shoulder, the bad shoulder, the one that takes her weight differently, and I put my arm around her. She said, "I'm glad you were the blacksmith in this town." I said, "I'm glad you brought me the drawing." She said, "I almost didn't." I said, "I know, you told me." She said, "I keep telling you because I keep thinking about what would have happened." I said, "You would have managed." She said, "I would have. But it wouldn't have been this." The fire was going in the forge, the clean cold morning outside, the smell of iron and wood smoke, and the linseed I'd oiled the crutch with the night before. Her weight against my side, her hand in mine. I've made a lot of things in my life. I've made hooks and hinges and gate hardware and decorative scrollwork and rifles fittings and shelf brackets and a rocking chair. I've made a crutch in a single night for a woman I'd never met and would never see again. Some of what I've made is still standing somewhere out on the plains, gates on ranches I've never seen, hardware on houses whose owners have come and gone. Iron lasts. That's the thing about iron. If you do it right, it outlasts you. The chair is still in our bedroom. We've been in this house 12 years now, and that chair has been rocked in every night of those 12 years, and it fits her the same as the day I made it. I know because she still tells me. She will sit down in it in the evening and say, "Still right," and I will be in the other chair, the plain one, the one for me, the one that doesn't have any particular adjustments because I have never required them, and I will say, "Good," and we will sit in the quiet of the house we have made. She teaches still. She's taught half the children in Harlan's Crossing in the last 12 years, and she has the school properly organized now, 2 levels, morning and afternoon. With a second teacher, she trained herself. Her drawings are on the wall of the school, actual drawings, mechanical and architectural. She teaches the older children drafting as part of their practical education, because she says if nobody had taught her drafting, she would never have known to ask for the chair. I think that's right. Cornelius Alderman died 4 years ago, and at the end he was all right with me, mostly. He came to dinner on Sundays. He told me once, in a rare clear moment, that he had been wrong about what she needed. He didn't say it pretty. He said it the way men say hard things, flat, looking at the table, and then moving on. I said I appreciated him saying it. He said, that was as much as either of us could manage. Harlan Webb married a woman from a farm in Nebraska, and by all accounts they're fine. Good for them. I have nothing against the man. He didn't see what I saw, and I'm glad of it. The forge is bigger now. I have 2 men working for me, a young fellow from Ohio named Burdick who is going to be very good, and a Mexican man named Paz who is already good and knows it, which keeps things honest. I still do the fine work myself. The chair repairs, the fitted hardware, the things that need to be thought about rather than just executed. People come to me from outside of town now. Word has moved down the trail about the blacksmith in Harlan's Crossing who will build fitted things. Crutches, braces, modified tools for men who have lost fingers, chair adjustments, special boot hardware for limbs that have healed wrong. I don't advertise it. I don't call it anything. I just do the work and charge fair, and they go away with something that fits. Clara says I should charge more. I say probably. We argue about it pleasantly on the evenings I mention it, which is sometimes just to hear the argument, to hear her voice getting practical and firm about it. She's right. I probably should charge more. But I look at it this way. My father made a hook when he was a grown man, and it was a competent hook. I made a hook when I was 11, and it was a good hook. The difference between competent and good is not talent. It's caring what the thing is for, caring who it's going to. The chair in the corner, the evening light, her hand in mine. That is what it's for. That has always been what it's for.